Alright, what's up everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, aka Mr. Delks Moses, aka I anoint myself with grease and I'm governed by caprice. The black man is God, the white man is the devil, and today we are starting part 2 of our 11th book in our Book to React series, our first fan request, Sissy Insurgencies by Marlon B. Ross. We started reading this book yesterday and did an hour-and-a-half live stream trying to get through the first chapter, which is quite long, and so I want to give a shout out to my guy DoorOfEl for sending me this very interesting book, fascinating book, and shout out to everybody else who's going to join the live stream. If you have a book that you think will be good to read on this channel, put it in the comments section. Let's try to get to it. And shout out to everybody else who's going to jump into the comments section of the live stream right now, because I will be reading every single comment that comes in, and also the comments under the previous book reacts, no matter which one it is. We've read 10 other books in this series, cover to cover, for everybody to soak in, be entertained by, and also learn from. And we're going to be doing the same thing for this very long, very academic, but very fascinating book by Marlon B. Ross. If you don't know who Marlon B. Ross is, he is a professor at the University of Virginia. This is the man right here. And this book you can pick up on Amazon for the humble price of only $30 paperback and $37 hardcover. So shout out to everybody who wants to support black authors, black intellectuals, black thinkers, and also support this very, very trill channel. So, in our last live stream, I came into this thinking that this book was going to be very anti-LGBTQ, very anti-effeminate black men, very, how can I say this, sort of male chauvinistic, homonormative, that sort of thing. Heteronormative. But instead it wasn't that. It actually turned out to be a book that is exploring what it means to be effeminate, while presenting as a masculine black man and presumably being a heterosexual black man. And first and foremost, I have to say I have no problem with gay black people at all. I'm not a gay basher. I'm not somebody with some sort of hang-up about gay black folks at all. So I went into this book because DoorOfEl is a homophobe on my channel, and I wanted to engage with his work because I don't feel like it's good to have a closed mind. So that's why I started reading this book, but I was pleasantly surprised and thankfully surprised to find out that this book is more nuanced, more intellectual, and actually not just a black man writing from the perspective that essentially, hey, being gay or being effeminate or being non-masculine normative is bad for black men, right? Like, of course, that's, you know, not what any, I would say, sane intellectual person would say, right? So anyway, we're going to be continuing here with this section, Speculating Richard Wright as Sissy Test Case, and also Sissy Liminality as another section in chapter 1, which is quite long, about 50 pages, and then we'll pick up with 2 more parts in tomorrow's live stream. So stay tuned all the time and turn on those notifications. Let's get into it. So, Speculating Richard Wright as Sissy Test Case. As with Young, Ferguson, and Nero, my early reading habits fostered both a racial and a gender cross-identification. It was not until college that I began to find African-American texts that seemed to capture facsimiles of my own sissy yearnings. On encountering the young Richard of Richard Wright's Black Boy, 1945, I instinctively gravitated toward his notion that words could be powerful weapons. When little 5-year-old Richard takes his father's figurative words literally, he hangs the kitten that his father had told him to get rid of, responding to his father's ill temper with his own verbal wit, which unfortunately results in the lynching of an innocent kitten. I'm not necessarily suggesting that Richard, the protagonist of Wright's autobiography, is a sissy. Wright is careful to construct the young protagonist in terms that lodge him securely in a naturalized boyishness, in spite of, or perhaps to compensate for, his propensity for reading. We can exploit Wright, though, as an exemplary test case of the challenge presented to anyone attempting to understand the sissy's character and conduct. His physiological, temperament, behavior, role, status, affect, self-identification, and discursive representation across historical circumstances, geographic climes, and racial formations. Wright's case is helpful to the project of historicizing the notion of sissiness as too good boy conduct in terms of the moral and social dilemmas that Jim Crow imposes on masculine performance. I just recently bought Richard Wright's Black Boy. I have it in my library here at home. I haven't had a chance to crack it open yet. I've only read one Richard Wright book before, and that was Native Son, by my own volition, not as a school project. And I'm kind of mad that Marlon wanted to give a spoiler for one of the main plot points in the film. Shame on you, Marlon. Shame on you for ruining this book for me. I'm joking. Continuing here. One approach would be to identify particular authors as sissies based on autobiographical, biographical, and fictional accounts. To say the least, this is a tricky matter, and one I'm prone to deploy cautiously by more frequently focusing on an author's textual self-representation and any representation of sissy characters, rather than reductively relying on the question of whether the author himself is a sissy in real life. Even so, I find that autobiographical modes are an especially rich resource for speculating about racialized formations of gender fitness. Here, I am interested less in the formal and thematic, that is, the ostensibly literary applications of the autobiographical subject, than in the cultural transactions that necessarily operate between autobiography and social perceptions of self and other, as these expose representations and discourses of male gender fitness. As Kenneth Mostern has theorized about the identity politics of autobiography, this genre is deeply institutionalized to represent social identities as though they are solely individualized subjects, but modes of minority autobiography tend to spotlight the binds and fissures at work between a representative self and its various publics. Writing life stories really does engage one of the problematic of presenting an explicitly public identity. Mostern observes, even when such an identity fails to fully explain the life. Reading racialized self-representations of these autobiographical subjects as always collectively and publicly constituted through gendered conduct, I seek to highlight the situational gender dynamics being negotiated by representing a raced self as a publicly consumable figure. Basically, what he's trying to say here is like writing full autobiographies can never really capture the full self, and there's a little bit of performance when it comes to writing your life story, especially as a black man presenting in a white supremacist world, is how I'm interpreting that. Thus, autobiographies by Washington, Johnson, Baldwin, Baraka, 1990s academic public intellectuals, and openly gay professional sportsmen are understood as inextricably interrelated with mass public perceptions of such subjects as sentiently, cognizantly, and or willfully gendered, sometimes analyzed as the representation of a public reception within text, as in the case with Johnson's autobiographies, and at other times analyzed as well in terms of how public discourses shape and are shaped by the intervention of the text, as with the response to Washington's Up from Slavery, Baldwin's various autobiographical essays and semi-autobiographical fiction, or professional sportsmen's gay disclosure memoirs. I examine the perception, projection, reception, or suspicion of sissiness as it is lodged by others, Washington and Carver in Chapter 2, James Baldwin in Chapter 4, and Amiri Baraka in Chapter 5, and openly gay pro-athletes in Chapter 6, and the response to these accusations as a marker for the social, ideological, and political uses toward which sissy suspicion is put. In other cases, as with James Weldon Johnson and his character, the ex-colored man, Chapter 3, gender nonconformity seems the very matter of self-characterization, even if the term sissy itself is never used in Johnson's memoir and novel. This requires a degree of speculation about the intentions, affects, and purposes of the representation of particular nonconforming gender characteristics and behaviors. In some cases, however, individuals either express their sissiness, whether implicitly or explicitly, or seem to overly protest it through distancing, denying, and avoiding tactics. So basically what he's trying to say here is like, he's trying to analyze the effeminacy, if that is the correct word to use, the effeminacy that's projected through some of these openly gay writers like James Baldwin and men that we do not know for sure if they were gay or effeminate, right, in their affect or representation, like Washington Carver, or I would bring up Benjamin Banneker, for example, and then trying to analyze how people perceive a femininity or femininity in their writings, in their works, and also if any could be derived by just reading the source text directly is how I'm understanding this. I think it's like, how in hip hop people assumed for a long time certain rappers or entertainers were gay, like Diddy, for example, because of how he represented himself on screen and stuff like that. But also like how he spoke about his gayness or a femininity or something like that, if that makes sense, right? Like Diddy always denied being gay or bisexual or anything like that, but we've heard stories about Diddy doing such activities, right, or having such characteristics. Continuing here. All right, in all cases, the individual habit of sissy avoidance, stemming from the hegemony of sissyphobia, abets or our understanding of how historical figures have negotiated charges of unfit manliness. Although sissyphobia, the hyperbolic fear of being perceived as or being too proximate to a sissy, obviously is closely linked with homophobia. Distinguishing between the two helps us to explore the entangled interaction connecting male gender nonconformity with male homosexuality. It is far easier to identify sissyphobia than sissiness, a fact that simultaneously works to the benefit and the detriment of any male accused of being a sissy. For just as sissiness is easily denied because proof is at best speculative, so it is also easily charged due to the predilection to stigmatize the slightest perceived deviation from masculine norms. Because the facile label or insinuation of sissiness also prompts a suspicion of homosexuality, sissyphobia guards against non-normative gender conduct by linking it so inextricably with sexual conduct that historically has been not only highly stigmatized but also widely illegal as a jailable offense. Unlike homosexual acts and behaviors, there have been no U.S. federal laws or state statutes banning sissiness. So to attack a man as a sissy invites other extra-legal modes of social punishment, ranging from ridicule and shaming to physical violence. Basically saying here, this book is examining non-traditional roles and norms exhibited by men who were expected to uphold traditional masculine roles or act in a certain masculine type way. And if they don't act in that certain type of way, and if they lean towards femininity, then they are classified as sissies. And that's, different than homosexuality, because a homosexual, there have been actual laws against being gay, committing gay acts. But as generally, there have not been laws about men acting in effeminate ways, right? Because that's just more of a personal choice that people get to make, and our laws in the Western world generally protect personal rights, civil liberties to express oneself. All right. We can see how the sissy charge operates by briefly considering how Wright's first biographer, Margaret Walker, deploys it speculatively. Walker provides us a concise dictionary of terms used to designate or indicate suspicion of a sissy nature. He gave the appearance of an almost slightly effeminate personality. He had a pipsqueak voice, small delicate hands and feet, smooth face with very light beard, and rather fastidious ways or mannerisms. He certainly did not exude a strong maleness or masculinity. Although she never uses the word sissy, a reader has no doubt about the charge, for Walker piles on suspect characteristics, a typical pattern when such a charge is being made, as if to compensate for the claim's speculative nature. Although Walker's first-hand observations should not be facilely affirmed, neither should they be facilely dismissed as gossipy or armchair psychoanalyzing. As a one-time intimate friend and an author in her own right, Walker had powerful skills of observation that could be trained on Wright at close quarters, but she may also have had interested motives. Because there is no proof of evidence, as can be the case with a practicing homosexual, judging a sissy disposition is necessarily a speculative, not to say gossipy, enterprise. Ooh, she's trying to say that, who is this, Alice Walker? Yeah, no, Margaret Walker. Margaret Walker was being gossipy, saying, "I was around Richard Wright, and he ain't act like no man. He kind of acted like a girl. You know, he had like a effeminate quality to him. But that's so like interpretive, right? Like somebody might say, "Oh, Simon Hill is not masculine. Simon Hill is a sissy because he doesn't have a very deep voice." You get what I'm saying? Like this is very subjective how you interpret this. You get what I'm saying? But I'm gonna continue here. As both Philip Brian Harper and Mark Anthony Neal point out in different ways, whether where others' sexuality is involved, there is always a degree of speculation. Other theorists have pointed out how rumor and gossip have played a crucial role in enabling viable social networks, especially for sexually discreet gay men excluded from dominant gay white institutions and resources even after Stonewall. Gossip about homosexuality, however, is a double force, working as a constructive vehicle for social connectivity among multiple marginalized groups like black queer men, but also being exploited as a prohibitive social and state apparatus to discipline, shame, and ruin the lives of anyone suspected of queer sexual behavior. Given that the sissy shadows the homosexual not only as a specter that polices the gender nonconformity supposedly intrinsic to sexual aberration, but also as the assumed vestibule of homosexuality in the dominant social imaginary, the prescriptive role of gossip, innuendo, and rumor is all the more salient for disciplining sissy conduct. Basically saying because sissies act like women and we assume that women gossip more than men, this is the proper way to identify and treat sissies. So giving masculine men sort of a way of acting feminine by gossiping about men that they think are feminine by doing a feminine activity, which is gossiping, right? For one thing, as discussed below, sissiness is liminal and projected onto others or onto the self as existing somewhere between an impossible masculine ideal and an ever shifting threat of masculine failure. For another thing, evidence is necessarily in the eye of the perceiver and in the eye of the subject perceived as coded within a particular cultural context at a particular time, using language that can be, at best, slippery and at worst, obfuscating. One man's sense of deficit, manly conduct, may be another's expression of sensible vulnerability. I spoke about this last time, like how in the Muslim world a delicate handshake is considered masculine. This is what a good Muslim man is supposed to do. For this study, rather than frowning on speculation as somehow cognitively and morally culpable, speculation is taken to be an important theoretical enterprise for comprehending the etymological, ideological, historical, social, material, and psychic dynamics of sissification. It is easy to dismiss Walker's observations, as most scholars have done, simply by ignoring Walker's implications. Because Wright conducted himself in strict accordance with heterosexual protocols as far as we know, Walker's charges are quickly dismissed. Unless there is a preponderance of evidence suggesting a homosexual liaison, hegemonic heteronormativity, or what Adrian Rich theorizes as compulsive heterosexuality, demands the assumption of heterosexuality, especially in the case of celebrated figures like Richard Wright or Malcolm X. I always thought that Richard Wright was a homosexual. I'm confused. I need to read up on the brother's history. I just always had it in my mind, or at least until recently when I really started getting into reading and stuff like that, that Richard Wright was known to be a homosexual. But we instead should start from the position that heterosexuality was the norm, and unless otherwise known, we should assume that because it's sort of compulsive for all men, all people in society to fall within heterosexuality. All right, so if one is not judged as homosexual, then one is not presumed a sissy. This
mobile device has lost connection to the internet.
all right, so
Try again a bit later.
all right, that sort of freaked me out. That's a tablet. Okay, sorry. I have a. What the hell is that? Sorry. Sorry. I got a tablet here that's going off. All right, sorry about that. I'm trying to make sure this thing doesn't turn on again. Okay, let me make sure the volume is as low as possible. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. That's not even, that's very weird. That's not even my tablet. That's my wife's tablet. Okay, anyway, continuing here. Let me take a quick water break while I'm at it. Okay. All right. If one is not judged a homosexual, then one is not presumed a sissy. This results in a paradox. While heterosexuality is the overwhelming presumption for everyone, the slightest perceived deviation from masculine conduct causes a rush to sissy accusations. And from such an accusation, the presumption of homosexuality follows precipitously. To speculate on a man's sissiness itself usually serves a stigmatizing social or political purpose beyond the demand to enforce heteronormativity. Sissy shaming is so common in activity, based in both vulgar and subtle assumptions about proper gender conduct, that until recently, its accusatory stigma has not been systematically articulated, much less systematically challenged. That Walker's speculation enacts a not-so-subtle attack on rights goes without saying. Even though Wright's Richard of Black Boy could be seen as displaying some telltale signs of sissiness, including the boy's propensity to escape into voracious reading. Perhaps more compelling is the way the author insists on naturalizing Richard's boyishness. Wright goes to great pains to ensure that Richard is not perceived as a too good boy. He is, in fact, something of a rascal, a rebel in the making, who boasts and seethes against first a father and then a Jim Crow system that he refuses to allow to unnerve or unman him. In fact, Wright purposefully creates a sissy foil, Shorty, to highlight the protagonist's properly gendered courage. Wright exploits this foil to cast his young protagonist as possessing so mannish a native temperament that he cannot help but comport himself in ways that defy emasculating Jim Crow humiliations. In characterizing Shorty, Wright, like Walker, piles on characteristics that invite suspicion. He spotlights his first physical, then phrenological, then psychological, then cultural attributes that we will see referenced repeatedly as markers of a sissy sensorium. The most colorful of the Negro boys on the job was Shorty, the round, yellow, fat elevator operator. He had tiny, beady eyes that looked out between rolls of flesh with a hard but humorous stare. He had the complexion of a Chinese, a short forehead and 3 chins. Psychologically, he was the most amazing specimen of the Southern Negro I had ever met. Hard-headed and sensible, a reader of magazines and books, he was proud of his race and indignant about its wrongs. But in the presence of whites, he would play the role of a clown of the most debased and degraded type. Soft, miniaturized, physical features first distinguish the specimen, and his yellowness further softens him. Then the passage turns to phrenology as the narrator assigns to Shorty a foreign look, the complexion of a Chinese, etc. An estrangement within the familial and familiar that we shall see James Baldwin theorize as a perception of gender queerness. You know, this makes me think about Drake. This makes me think about Drake to some degree, because Drake has been a sissy in the Marlon B. Ross sense in the public eye, because of his embracing of some degrees of femininity while maintaining some level of masculinity in his presence, you know, with the beard and the braids and the tattoos and, you know, the misogyny in some of his lyrics and stuff like that. But then also the softness of him by singing, by being emotional, by coming across as the guy who's not afraid to cry in front of his girl, you know what I mean? And just generally being a fellow more in touch with his feelings and being more artistic, and Kanye West to some degree. I think this book would have been interesting. It's written in 2022, and Marlon B. Ross is an older man. I think he was born in like the 50s or something like that, right? So he's an older man, so maybe he's not in touch with hip-hop, but it would be very interesting to have an analysis of sissydom within hip-hop, right? Because I believe all great artists gender bend. Michael Jackson, Prince, James Brown, Drake, LL Cool J, Jay-Z, Tupac Shakur, all of them gender bend to some degree. Tupac was a sissy. Jay-Z, to some degree, embodies some sissiness. Drake definitely embodies some sissiness. I think, to some degree, to be a public-facing entertainer, especially a black man, to be a great artist, you have to become a sissy, to some degree. Sissy in the sense that you are more effeminized and less in your masculinity, traditional masculinity, is de-emphasized. DMX, one of the most masculine presenting rappers of all time, barks like a pit bull dog, ripped from head to toe, takes his shirt off and is the most aggressive fool ever, cries on stage to a presumably white Jesus. I mean, come on, man. I mean, it can get deep if you really think about it. But let's continue here. So I'm going to continue. So that a budding writer should note another's fascination with reading magazines and books may seem fitting, but mentioning this in the context of the boy's racial passive aggressiveness, proud of his race but a clown in the presence of whites, seems to make the focus on the other's literacy suspect. Wright then proceeds to dramatize Shorty's tendency toward minstrel subservience. When Richard observes Shorty extending his butt so that a white male passenger on the elevator can kick it before plopping a quarter into Shorty's open mouth. Oh my God, if that happened in real life, boy, there was some raccooning going on back then that was next level. Richard is scandalized, feeling no anger or hatred, only disgust and loathing. When Richard asks Shorty why he would do such a thing, Shorty responds, "Listen, N-word." And I don't have a problem saying N-word. It's just YouTube likes to demonetize me for saying it. "Listen, N-word, my ass is tough and my quarters is scarce." That's funny. Wright is here placing Shorty in the position of a black boy so self-emasculated that he might be regarded as metaphorically raped by the white master. Consenting, at least ostensibly, to have his anus penetrated by the white man's shoe, Shorty shifts from being the object of Richard's sissy suspicion to becoming a homosexual, at least figuratively. If Shorty will enact this consensual anal penetration in public, no telling what he would consent to in private for a few more quarters. I mean, that's a bar. That's a bar right there. I mean, that's facts. I mean, come on now. That's, yeah. I mean, no more needs to be said. All right, through the white man's kicking Shorty in the ass, Wright implies male anal penetration, and in Shorty's opening his mouth to receive the white man's quarter, Wright furthers the analogy by insinuating symbolic fellatio. Wright explicitly calling Shorty out first as a soft sissy, and predictably capping with metaphorical implications of, you see the word right there. I'm not going to say it, but you know what it is. Wright encourages the reader to speculate beyond mere suspicion. Shorty is not the true subject here. It is Richard's fit manliness that Wright is concerned to shore up. Proof of fit manliness against the castrating horrors of Jim Crow is manifested in Richard's response to Shorty's perversion, a scapegoating of the homo sissy as a natural race traitor that we will see reprised in some black nationalist writing. Interesting. Richard's appropriate manly and thus moral reaction of disgust and loathing guides our moral response as readers. In the later Chicago section of Black Boy, Richard records a similar reaction to a South Side literary group, whereby he observes, "I was encountering for the first time the full-fledged Negro Puritan invert, the emotionally sick." Also in his scenario, Richard links sexual inversion to the kind of racial alienation also discussed by Vershawn Young. In speech and action, they strove to act as un-Negro as possible, Wright observes about the fall writers in the group. Both Shorty and the Southside fall literati sharply contrast with Richard's manly directness in the Jim Crow South and in Southside Chicago. Even as a small child, Richard's native propensity dictates his bold aggression as he prioritizes survival in life and death situation. When his mother takes the boy to beg money from his philandering and absent father, Richard not only refuses to go live with his father, but also refuses the paltry offer of a nickel, which his mother urges him not to take, though the father suggests that she is teaching him to be a fool. I wanted to take the nickel, but I did not want to take it from my father, Richard says. Richard's boyish defiance, even in the face of a nickel that the family so desperately needs, indicates how prescient mannishness, when properly disciplined, need not be modeled on his father's failed husbanding and fathering, but instead can become the basis of a virile and thus radically liberating character and conduct. Basically, he's trying to say here is like Richard became a man by standing up to his father right here, right? And manliness is sometimes defined by opposition to other men. Masculinity is defined by how much can we resist or defy or oppress another man, right? I had the feeling that I had to do with something. I had the feeling that I had to do with something unclean, Richard remembers. By equating the father's offer with filth, we immediately understand that the boy is making an astute moral judgment not about the father's bodily hygiene, but instead about his character and conduct. This passage foreshadows the Shorty incident in which the soft boy trades his mouth and ass for a quarter, whereas the little boy Richard, refusing the nickel, gets distance from stigmatizing sissy traits like softness, strangeness, passive aggressiveness, menstrual subservience, and race betrayal. Both the father and Shorty figure conduct so abhorrent that it sickens Richard, but each male's conduct resides at opposed ends of a gender scale, with the father's behavior exposing a flaw fully within the character of the patriarchal masculine, whereas Shorty's threatens to cast him out of the purview of the masculine altogether. The father is all too much the man, if a morally unfit one. Shorty is hardly a man and is thus morally unfit. Exactly because Richard seems to exhibit qualities like a devotion to reading, poetry, and imaginative flights that could easily elicit speculation of sissiness. Wright must work harder to distance his autobiographical hero from such suspicion, ironically demanding the presence of other sissies as a foil and thus shielding against the specter of the protagonist's own sissiness. Walker was probably not the first to charge Wright with sissiness. For a boy like Wright, Richard would be a convenient target for another boy's projections. The little boy Richard's moral sense of uncleanliness in the face of a philandering, incompetent father and husband corresponds to the young man Richard's moral sense of disgust, a natural physiological reaction from the gut in the face of Shorty's and the Southside inverts' emasculated and emasculating conduct. Given Wright's use of the sissy foil and his tendency to feature sissies and F-words across his oeuvre, it is not surprising that there has been a persistent, low-key scuffle over how to characterize the author's relation to gender nonconformity. Baldwin infamously attacked Wright in his first published essay, Everybody's Protest Novel, reprinted in Notes of a Native Son, by reducing his greatest hero, Bigger Thomas, to an Uncle Tom figure, and by placing Wright in an unseemly, symbolic sexualized wrestling match with Harriet Beecher Stowe. What? Okay. I have to read this. James Baldwin is a fool. He's a fool. As Baldwin himself becomes the most articulate literary spokesman on behalf of civil rights, the young Turks of Black Power begin to scapegoat him through his sissy reputation, contrasting the soft Baldwin with the hard-bodied Wright. In the most egregious case of over-the-top scapegoating, in an essay significantly titled Notes on a Native Son, italics added, Eldridge Cleaver accuses Baldwin of wanting to be inseminated by white men in order to have their mulatto babies, a passage voluminously commented on. Yo, one of my favorite things when I was a young kid, when I was young and I was reading a lot, was like reading all the gossipy stuff between all the different writers. Like, I remember reading a book where somewhere somebody said Huey P. Newton had kissed Eldridge Cleaver or something like that. I can't remember the exact details, but then Eldridge Cleaver responding, no, I never kissed him. I kissed another nigga, something like that. Like, the shit was hilarious. I don't know, man. Eldridge Cleaver is a crazy dude. I don't know if he's still living. Is Eldridge Cleaver still living? Maybe we should read Soul on Ice on stream. I read Soul on Ice when I was a kid, and it was a very intense book, and I wouldn't mind picking it up again. Anyway, so, yeah. So, the charge that Baldwin wanted to be inseminated by white men, though, is capped with Cleaver's defense of Wright as a foil to Baldwin, vaguely and inaccurately citing Wright's Aggie West passage from The Long Dream, discussed in Chapter 6, as a case of the practice by Negro youths of going punk hunting. Cleaver claims this is one of Wright's few comments on the subject of homosexuality. Feeling the need to distance the homosexually obsessed Wright, according to Walker, from homosexuality to make him a harder foil to Baldwin, Cleaver proceeds to the knockout punch. I think it can safely be said that the men in Wright's book, albeit shackled with a form of impotence, were strongly heterosexual. Wright's male characters are, then, like Richard's father, all too manly sexually, if plagued by the social impotence that sometimes occasions a fully masculine appetite and ambition, especially for African American men under Jim Crow. Unlike Cleaver's Sisyphonic scapegoating attack on Baldwin, his defense of Wright is rarely commented on, but one cannot grasp the impact of the former without focusing on the gender logistics of the latter. So yeah, just to comment on this, I think to some degree, black men, to make it in this white supremacist world, have to some degree, downplay their masculineness, their virility sexually, their athleticism, their strength, right? We have to downplay traditional forms of masculinity to survive in a white supremacist world. And to some degree, we all have to be like, Shorty in the elevator. We have to let the white man kick us in the ass, and when he pops a quarter in our mouth, we open up wide. You know what I mean? We don't explicitly do that today, but, we live in a system of capitalism where the faces on the money don't look like us. In fact, the faces on the money hated people like us, and the people who still print the money hate people that look like us because they are the devil. So, to some degree, I can kind of get, what Eldridge Cleaver is saying, and also like extrapolate more from that, right? Like, masculinity in black is a very complicated thing. Masculinity in black is femininity with a masculine bent, right? So Cleaver is defensive about safely seeing Wright's men as strongly heterosexual, exactly because they are problematically shackled with a form of impotence. Cleaver wants to ensure that these characters' impotence is not misconstrued as sissiness or what you see on the screen. I'm not going to say it. This is why Cleaver over-protests in making the case for Bigger Thomas's revolutionary virility. And Bigger Thomas, Wright's greatest creation, was a man in violent, though inept, rebellion against a stifling, murderous, totalitarian white world. There was no trace in Bigger of a Martin Luther King type, self-effacing love for his oppressors. For example, Bigger would have been completely baffled, as most Negroes are today, at Baldwin's advice to his nephew concerning white people. You must accept them and accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope. Italics added, raising Bigger to the status of a real person, a practice common among black nationalist writers. Cleaver allows Wright's greatest creation to stand in for the author himself as a properly masculine warrior, however inept, against white male supremacy. Cleaver's homo-sisyphonic accusation represents a typical scapegoating tactic in the post-civil rights moment among some black nationalists, but this tactic garners its punch from an assertion of an alternatively manly code of conduct in black history, here embodied in the fictional Bigger. Like Baraka's attempt to expunge his sissy self by scapegoating nonviolent civil rights leaders, Cleaver is here trying to eviscerate the palpable influence that the homo sissy Baldwin has had on his own authorial persona, ironically as self-evident in the autobiographical style of Soul on Ice itself. Too penetrable, too vulnerable, too soft to engage the enemy at the front line of the racial war, Baldwin and Shorty are figures for one of the earliest meanings of the term sissy: unmanly cowardice. Undergirding Cleaver's charge against Baldwin and Richard's against Shorty is the disappointment for men whose manly character is ostensibly perverted by the overriding power of white male supremacy. In short, they are insinuated as men sissified by Jim Crow. Exactly what I was trying to say. Exactly what I was trying to say, but better said. But better said. Wright's reference to Shorty as a clown in the face of White's reference to Shorty as a clown in the face of whites enlists him in the iconography of the Jim Crow minstrel figure as an improperly gendered black man. From the 1830s to the 1950s, the most popular cultural figuration of black manhood is projected onto minstrel slackness, a sort of physiological softness in demeanor, gesture, and gait that in turn communicates sissy cowardice. Slackness is the visual cue exploited by blackface performers to indicate the essence of black maleness as a lack of masculine nerve. It is the image of the loose-jointed Jim Crow whose body constitutionally lacks spine, lacks backbone, lacks phallic hardness. Thomas Daddy Rice's antebellum blackface performance of the Jim Crow character has often been noted for its mockery of black slave culture and black manhood. Following Michael Rogan, we should go further in considering the sexual implications of blackface minstrelsy. It is not only analogous to gender cross-dressing, as Rogan observes. It is indeed also a mode of sexual cross-dressing, whereby black manhood is racially mocked by turning the black man, if not into a woman, then into an effeminate sissy. Well, here we go here. So here, is the figure of Daddy Rice performing Jumpin' Jim Crow, a popular etching of Thomas Daddy Rice, who was a white man, by the way. And this is from the Library of Congress, published in 1835. And there's a deep history here. We need to read a book on the real Jim Crow, right? And where this term and phrase came from, right? But yeah, Jim Crow comes across as like, a cross-dresser, somebody with effeminate qualities. I mean, flapping his hands around, hands on the hip, kind of curvaceous. I mean, the way the picture is drawn, I see the picture, I see breasts. I see the coat is puffed up to make it look like he has breasts. And his hips are extra large like a woman's and stuff like that, right? And when we look at the women in the back here, to some degree, even though they are animals, right? They sort of have the same figure. Even though that's a male animal, that's a female animal, you see a lot of the sameness in that, right? Anyway, so the one sketch we have of Daddy Rice's performance visually communicates in volumes what need not have been verbally articulated for it to have demeaning gender effect. Right hand on softly feminine oversized hips, left arm lifted with a fey hand gesture, hip jutted out in a posture closely identified with the female African primitive. The drawing captures the gender insult that the words of the song, the only other record of the performance recorded in the annals of history, need not say. Drawing on the legacy of Jim Crow minstrelsy, popular stagings and filming of Negro manhood were often performed to accentuate effeminate physical embodiment. Limp wrist, hips flexibly extended with a skipping gait, or shoulders stooped, head bowed, eyes droopily cast down, feet dragging. The contrary to figurations of fit manliness, the muscled athlete, the alert revolutionary, the upright statesman, or the brave soldier at attention. Wright's portrait of Shorty draws on African American cultural disgust for the Jim Crow minstrel, which is linked to the Uncle Tom as a discredited stereotype of unfit black manliness. To desire black manliness, to insist on occupying that gendered race identity, is an impenetrable act of bravery, so overwhelming in its implications that no white man can possibly imagine the ethical character it requires, much less the quotidian heroic conduct it demands under Jim Crow regime. No wonder tomming or playing the clown, playing the Uncle Tom for white men's sadistic pleasure, can be so tempting a mode of economic survival for a soft boy like Shorty. In this case, too good sissy obedience Too good sissy obedience, which in black nationalist thought is imagined as a desire to be penetrated by the white man, transfigures into too ready obeisance to white male authority, a habit, if not more endemically, a behavior that guarantees race betrayal. If masculine uprightness strongly implies a moral code that shapes male character predictably toward narrow modes of gender conduct, black men's uprightness becomes intrinsically contested, not only by the presumptions of white male supremacy, but also by black men's moral judgment of one another, whether privately or by airing dirty laundry. Goodness for a black man indexes a relative ethos shaped by the pressures of white supremacy, so much so that in African American vernacular, bad becomes an epithet signaling a positive style of resistant black manliness, inferring in turn that any black man who is too good deserves to have his manhood called into question. As we shall see, this iconography of the good Negro inflects negative reactions to such reforming figures as Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King Jr., and James Baldwin in particular moments of rising impatience with black male leaders who counsel such strategies as short-term accommodation in exchange for economic profit, long-suffering nonviolence, or taking the moral high ground as an act of transcendent conscience. As the case of Wright's use of gender nonconformity exemplifies, rather than attempting to simply to categorize the gender identity of such historical figures and characters, I am more interested here in how the sissy discourse is employed as a writerly strategy to stage or perform a figure's relation to normative masculinity, often in the interest of other ideological and political enterprises. In other words, gender epithets like sissy and the F word are doing double duty, policing what constitutes proper manliness while also serving particular, often non-democratic political, economic, and ideological agendas that keep not only sexual but also gender and racial hierarchies intact, ultimately to the benefit of ruling white men. I mean, nobody's listening right now, but the people that need to hear this aren't here right now. DoorOfEl doesn't understand that he just sent me a book that essentially is saying by classifying black male activities in a certain box, putting us in a certain type of box of the way we should act, the way we should not act, only helps white supremacy, only helps maintain the hierarchy as it is now. But by breaking these conventions, breaking these norms, breaking these confines that we're in on how we are supposed to act in these social constructs that were created by other people anyway, we are actually creating a new world and more freedom for ourselves. Which is why I've said like no idea from anybody bashing gay people or effeminate black man will ever change my mind, because these things are not upholding white male supremacy. In fact, it's the opposite. Upholding the traditional gender norms, upholding traditional ways of what it means to be a man is going to just maintain the status quo, which is what we want to break. All right? So, around the same time I got acquainted with Wright's Richard, I discovered another narrative, James Baldwin's semi-autobiographical novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, whose two good protagonists, John Grimes, seem to harbor a similarly fantastical inner life as a shield against a disciplinarian father. The structure of feeling at work in Baldwin's John Grimes seemed so unfamiliar to me that I shuddered as I read the story of a gentle boy's coming into manhood on the eve of his 14th birthday, occasioned by his achieving salvation on the threshing floor of his stepfather's storefront Pentecostal church. To recognize John as my fictive double was to come to terms with my own sissy sensorium, an uncanny epiphany that would forever tinge my criticism on Baldwin with a certain defensive gratitude. Recently, I and other queer theorists have insisted on John Grimes' homosexuality, and appropriately so. Nevertheless, this rush to read John as a homosexual has caused us to overlook how the narrative also functions as a sissy Bill Dungsroman. Okay, so we have a word that I've never seen before. Bill Dungsroman definition. A novel dealing with one person's formative years or spiritual education. Interesting. Okay. That's the type of book I want to write. Spiritual years. Okay. Let's put that in the chat. Hold up. Did it go? Hold on, wait. Let me delete that. All right. Bill Dungsroman. Interesting. So, recently, I and other queer theorists have insisted on John Grimes' homosexuality, and appropriately so. Nevertheless, this rush to read John as a homosexual, and appropriately so. Nevertheless, the rush to read John as a homosexual has caused us to overlook how the narrative also functions as a sissy Bill Dungsroman, or basically an autobiography. To speculate on John's emotional and bodily practice, as well as that of Baldwin himself, as that of a sissy, is not intended to evacuate homosexuality as a constitutive component of their sissiness, as I will explain in Chapter 4. If Richard enacts his rivalry with his father through masculine violation, Baldwin's John enacts his rivalry more surreptitiously by outwardly seeming to join his father's church like a good boy. While I theorize this shielding behavior as sissy passive aggression, seeming to oversubmit to authority while indirectly undermining it, I do not intend to attach any of the usual negative moral and psychological connotations to this term. Indeed, as we shall see, such passive aggression can, as with Baldwin, enact ideological insurgency against the racial and sexual status quo. We might draw a larger point from this initial contrast between Wright's and Baldwin's deployment of a subtextual sissy discourse in fictions published in the decades after World War II. Although there is no doubt a shared social discourse about the sissy, that discourse is deployed toward different ideological effects and writerly effects, even by authors who would seem to share a common racial heritage writing in the same decade. To what extent geography also shapes one's relations to sissiness. Wright from the Deep South, writing about the interwar Deep South as an expatriate in France. Baldwin from Harlem, writing about interwar Harlem as an expatriate in Switzerland, is also an important factor. Interesting stuff here. All right, so I haven't read that much Baldwin. I can't even remember. Maybe I read The Fire Next Time or something like that when I was in high school, but I really need to start reading Baldwin. I have one of his books here, and I need to really crack it open. There's so much I haven't read. I need to get up on my game. I would really like to know what people like the homophobes on my channel, like DoorOfEl, think about James Baldwin, by the way. But continuing here, so Sissy Liminality. My sense of being a sissy emerged long before any notion of sexual object choice could come into play. Or more precisely, I early on harbored a sense of some sort of anomalous relation between gender expectations and my own failure to live up to those expectations long before I could even imagine a question of sexual attraction or gender object choice. Sissiness may very well be the vestibule of homosexuality, if not trans identity for many, but I want strongly to caution against equating these. Unlike homosexuality, which has become increasingly an articulated identity anchored in language, laws, and institutions in a plethora of ways, sissiness remains shadowy, incoherent, disarticulated, non-institutionalized, even as its speculative existence shores up seemingly more solid racial, gender, and sexual categories. If being too girlish seems a problem, then, like being with boys too much, could be just as unsettling. Not knowing naturally how much is too much is itself the conundrum. William Blake's maxim, "You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough," is the converse of the sissy's plight. A manly man like Blake dares to know, or at least conducts himself as knowing, how much is too much by enacting a daring violation across an invisible line. As Blake puts it, enough, or too much. A sissy boy seems to come up to that line of too much and trembles with uncertainty. Was liking being around girls too much versus liking being around boys the source of my gender discomfiture? This puzzle was further muddled by the fact that different boys at different ages seemed to shift from liking being around boys to liking being around girls enough to like them. Different temporal trajectories certainly help to define the perception of gender nonconformity, as C. Riley Snorton has illustrated in his History of Trans Identity, observing that the transitive character of gender usually projected onto trans persons more aptly applies across all identity formations, including those of sexuality and race. This concept of the transitive nature of sexual and racial identification will be especially helpful in analyzing not only Baldwin's process of learning how to fashion himself as a sissy, mentored by the artist Buford Delaney, but also James Weldon Johnson's autobiographical and fictional narratives addressing the gender options available to men seeking to wield an air of cosmopolitan urbanity to arm themselves at the height of Jim Crow violence. In the vernacular, the transitive and circumstantial nature of gender is bluntly acknowledged in the rush to suggest, on encountering an improperly gendered person, that time will cure the malady, that perhaps the boy or girl will grow out of it, or that a change of venue, sending the child to fresh air in the countryside or to a military academy, will make the difference. This recognition that gender is conditionally fungible or transitive usually is articulated to reassert heteronormativity. But there is no reason that it cannot work to undermine heteronormative assumptions, as Snorton has shown. Interesting. I mean, that's an interesting take right there. Like, parents will say, we're going to send you to boot camp for summer because we don't want you to become a sissy. We don't want you to become a queer. So you're saying that, what people are can be changed. It is built on your society. It's built around you. And why would I become a sissy if this house was not heteronormative? Are y'all hiding something? Is there a secret influence in the house? You get what I'm saying? So, yeah, it seems to be. But then those same people who say, we're going to send you to boot camp to become a boy or become a man, don't also have that same take like, you can be different things by the different experiences you have. Because they then say, no, boys are boys and girls are girls, as if it's set in stone. Very interesting take right there. I never thought about that. So, whether a factor of temporality or circumstance, any hint of apparent gender indecisiveness creates alarm because it draws attention to the potential liminality of all gender character and conduct. Liminality within gender, as much as, if not more than, a line between the genders, is what addled my attempts to be a natural boy rather than just a good one. For at the least I understood that a good boy meant necessarily always risking being too good for proper boyishness. Discursively, however, this gender uncertainty and anxiety within one's own male body, despite taking pleasure in possessing a male anatomy, is routinely articulated as a confusion that causes a boy to cross the line into girlishness. Perhaps it is a failure of language or of the social imagination that reads any small lack of masculine competence as necessarily catapulting a boy or man into the feminine, or more precisely, an effeminate sphere. This sissy dilemma seems analogous to the one-drop rule that governed Jim Crow, racial identity. The slightest hint of doubt about one's boyishness seems to catapult one into the realm of sissyhood. This feverish binary within the masculine, tough, soft, butch, femme, aggressive, passive, straight, sissy, comes under deep suspicion in this study, as I hope to build on work like that of Eve Kosofsky, Sedgwick, and Jack Halberstam, who seek to unsettle the line linking a binary gender system, masculine and feminine, to a binary sexuality, gay and straight. In her pivotal essay, How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay, The War on Effeminate Boys, Sedgwick observes that the increasing social acceptance of adult male homosexuality has not automatically benefited effeminate boys. Interesting. Indeed, the gay movement has never been quick to attend to issues concerning effeminate boys. There is a discreditable reason for this in the marginal or stigmatized position to which even adult men who are effeminate have often been relegated in the movement. A more understandable reason than effeminophobia. Interesting, I've never heard of that word. A more understandable reason than effeminophobia, however, is the conceptual need of the gay movement to interrupt a long tradition of viewing gender and sexuality as continuous and collapsible categories, a tradition assuming that anyone, male or female, who desires a man must by definition be feminine, and that anyone, male or female, who desires a woman must by the same token be masculine, that one woman as a woman must desire another, that one man as a man might desire another. The indispensable need to make these powerful subversive assertions seemed perhaps to require a relative de-emphasis of the links between gay adults and gender nonconforming children, to begin to theorize gender and sexuality as distinct, though intimately entangled axes of analysis has been indeed a great advance of recent lesbian and gay thought. I mean, I'm so surprised a homophobe sent me such a perplexingly interesting but challenging queer text. Thank you, DoorOfEl, for sending me a text that makes me think about gayness and homosexuality in a different way, because what he's trying to say here, DoorOfEl, and any other homophobe who's listening, is like, when we see gay people now, we tend to think of gay people as one person being effeminate and the other person being the masculine version, whether that be a gay couple or a lesbian couple. But it doesn't have to be that way. You get what I'm saying? And just because somebody is feminine does not automatically make them gay, as if they want to be a part of a homosexual relationship. There can be a heterosexual man who exhibits some forms of sissiness or femininity who is not also a homosexual person, right? And that's very fascinating for me, right? And yeah, that's just interesting. That's just an interesting way of looking at that, and something I haven't thought about before. So shout out to a homophobe for sending me this. Shout out to DoorOfEl. Continuing here. Sedgwick's point is born out of the fact that while homophobia has become a strongly stigmatized behavior in the United States and beyond, there is no commensurate term to capture society's stigma against effeminate boys, effeminophobia notwithstanding. Sedgwick further points out that there is a danger that that advance may leave the effeminate boy once more in the position of the haunting abject, this time the haunting abject of gay thought itself. Despite Sedgwick's urging of a queer theory that sees gender and sexuality as distinct though intimately entangled, her concern over effeminate boys becoming the haunting abject of gay thought itself, very little work has been conducted on the complex relation between the sissy boy and homosexuality, and on the implications of this relation, in turn to racial configurations. One important work that follows up on Sedgwick's theory is Halberstram's Female Masculinity, which examines the performance of masculinities among women and analyzes the relation between dominant and subordinate masculinities, including some attention to how women of different racial identities perform masculinities. Halberstram also instructively observes that male and female masculinities are constantly involved in an ever-shifting pattern of influences. He asks whether the question might be not what female masculinities borrow from male masculinities, but rather what do men borrow from butches? That's funny. All right. What do we borrow from them studs? Okay. In contesting the line between masculine and feminine by emphasizing the entangled relations among different modes of masculine performance, Halberstram helps us see how even within a sex socially constructed as one gender, whether male or female, there is no single manifestation of masculinity, whether performed by women, men, or trans persons. To understand sissy conduct and character as intrinsic to the range of masculinities, pluralizing the masculine rather than merely as slippage into the feminine, is not intended to underestimate the ideological compulsion to normalize one domineering expression of the masculine as morally ideal and socially upright. Halberstram's idea that men could learn how to be masculine from butch women is counterintuitive in U.S. discourses of gender and sexuality, but it is a touchstone of my study for understanding how normatively masculine men learn their masculinity from the conduct of sissies as an inverse object lesson. even though the sissy boy is most definitely the haunting abject of gay thought itself, as Sedgwick asserts, he is at the same time a liminal subject whose speculative existence helps to authorize and legitimate a uniform notion of dominant masculinity. Basically, in simple terms, right here, what he's trying to say is that, once again, men are able to define themselves by looking at other men and seeing what they do and saying, we are not that. They are not like us, essentially, right? And so when we see effeminate men or boys doing things that fall out of the norm of what we are taught is masculine behavior, we are then able to define ourselves as more masculine by not doing that. So if we see a boy wearing pink and he's the only boy wearing pink, then we say, yeah, he's not like us and we're more manly than him, right? Is essentially how I'm reading that. So, as we shall see, sissies serve as a constant reminder of the fragility of the line connecting maleness to conventional masculinity. And they pose a further challenge in that, far from being alien to the dominant masculine, sissies operate on a line defining both the inner limits of conventional masculinity and the masculine alien or abject, to use Sedgwick's term, within the social structure of maleness. Like Halberstram, I want to emphasize that there is a multiplicity of masculinities without ignoring the hegemonic impact of the dominant masculine. But I also want to go even further in illustrating the role that race plays in the formation of masculinities as multiple and yet hierarchized in relation to other social categories like race. The tendency of dominant culture to imagine black men as masculine and yet differently masculinized from middle-class white men helps us to see how the gender conduct of sissies cannot be grasped outside a racial frame. If black men are already one step removed from hegemonic masculinity, when scripted either as subserviently Uncle Tomish or as thuggishly hypermasculine, the black sissy is perceived as further marginalized. I want to suggest here, to the contrary, that just as white middle-class masculinity is unimaginable without its troubled and troubling relationship to black men, so white hegemonic masculinity has been haunted by and constructed on the unstable category of multiple marginalized black sissiness. And that's a great way of putting it. I mean, white men define their masculinity a lot of the times on what they're able to do to black men, have white police officers shoot them in the back, have presidents that say the Haitians eat cats and dogs. White men base their masculinity on a lot of the times off of what they see black men do, right? As in, not as in they're jealous of black men to some degree, though they do take some things from black defined masculinity and then make it their own. But at the same time, you know, white men do that. Black, straight, heteronormative men, compulsively heteronormative, heterosexual men, look at the black effeminate men, and especially black gay men, and let's not even talk about trans women. They look at them and say, we can define our own masculinity by what we are able to do to them, but also at the same time, how they are not like us. You get what I'm saying? So that's interesting. That's very interesting. I love this book. I love this book. This is so dope. All right, continuing here. The liminality of sissiness exposes not so much a failure of masculinity as an inherent failure in the masculine, as a paradigm that governs the conduct of men and boys. The fear of the sissy among men is the fear that masculinity is not natural to or in men. The fear that men possess individual and collective vulnerabilities particular to their gender conduct. Not falling prey to sissiness means refusing to hear or feel certain vulnerabilities, and instead to pose as infallibly masculine, even at those times when one's maleness feels most in jeopardy. In other words, not all vulnerabilities are unmasculine. The problem for all boys and men, however, concerns how to know which vulnerabilities are acceptable, which ones are not, and under which circumstances. On top of this, a male must instinctively know how to navigate the material gestures of invulnerability, usually signaled materially through the body's manner, and such gestural signals may change with time and circumstance. As we will see with the sports disclosure memoirs written at the turn of the 21st century, these first out pro athletes must negotiate not only persistent ideas about how a jock is to look and behave, but also a changing iconography of how a gay man can look and behave in bodily representation in the era of the Castro Street clone as a self possessed, conventionally gendered, macho white man who happens to be militantly gay. What is a Castro Street clone? I'm scared to look that up. I'll just take that as a very, very, like a Hotep gay person, like a Hotep white man, if that makes sense. Okay. The line between acceptable and unacceptable vulnerabilities is not historically or culturally stable. Whatever the time or place, those unacceptable vulnerabilities are projected onto the sissy as a contaminating vector of unfit masculinity. As we shall see, even as U.S. gender and sexual norms have changed in response to concerted activism, the sissy has remained a pretty reliable vehicle for marking and measuring upright masculinity in boys and men across the 20th century and into the 21st. Interesting, interesting. All right, so that was a very interesting read, reading those two chapters, examining Richard Wright as a sissy and the liminality of sissiness, right? So very interesting text so far. I'm really liking this book. Shout out DoorOfEl for this suggestion. Shout out everybody else who's going to watch this in the playback. This is a very dope read. We're going to come on live tomorrow to continue reading the next two sections and slowly chip away at this excellent book by Marlon B. Shout out to him. And shout out to everybody who's going to watch this once again. Catch me tomorrow, probably late in the evening, around this time or so, and we will be back. Y'all be easy.